Hey, everybody. I want to talk with you briefly about having a spiritual position of authority versus having spiritual authority. If we're going to model our lives after the life of Jesus and really have an influence and an impact in the lives of people, then we're going to have spiritual authority. Back in the Lord's day, there were Pharisees, there were teachers of the law, there were scribes. They were all a part of the quote-unquote clergy of that day. People would come to them with problems. They'd want direction. They'd want counsel, and on and on. The problem with the Pharisees is that they had a spiritual position, but they didn't have any spiritual authority. They weren't able to lead people in the ways of God because they didn't know the ways of God. The result is they led them on a detour into a life of religiosity rather than developing a relationship with the living God. Here now comes Jesus, and he begins to teach, and he begins to lead people. They begin to follow him, and he talks differently than the Pharisees did because he had spiritual authority. Here's what Mark chapter 1 says. The people, when they heard Jesus, they were amazed at his teachings. They weren't amazed at the Pharisees and the scribes and the teachers of the laws and those, but they were amazed at Jesus because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Now, I want to give you 5 steps that will help you. They've certainly helped me. Hopefully, they will help you to grow the same type of authority that Jesus had. But before I give you those 5 steps, let me lay 2 foundational stones. Number 1, you don't need a spiritual position or a title to have authority. See, the Pharisees, they had that position, but they didn't have any authority. Jesus didn't have a position in the eyes of man, but he did have that spiritual authority. So you don't need a title in order to have spiritual authority. The second thing that's very important is that authority the spiritual nature of authority is always rooted in authenticity. Jesus was the real deal. See, the Pharisees were hypocrites. Jesus lived in private the exact same way that he lived in public. And now that's good for us to understand because it actually is the first of the 5 steps that we need to take. First step, you got to commit yourself to living a life of honesty. You've got to be authentic. You can't live a life of pretense like the Pharisees did. I have met people that have sinned greatly, and what they've done is cover their sins. And they've presented themselves to people as if they've not sinned. We call them hypocrites. I've met other people who've done the exact same things that these other people have done. They've sinned, but rather than cover their sins, they've confessed, they've repented, and they've moved on. And they have carried with them a sense of a spiritual authority. Why? Because spiritual authority isn't based in or doesn't demand perfection. It just demands that you are honest and above board. Pharisees weren't that way. Jesus was that way. And if we want to experience the same type of spiritual authority, we have to commit ourselves, number 1, first step, to becoming authentic people. The second step is found in Luke chapter 7. And it's just simply this. Before you can have spiritual authority, you have to come under authority. You may recall the story of the centurion who had a servant who was sick. Didn't feel worthy to go to Jesus, so he sent his elders. Jesus started to come to the house. Halfway there, he sent his friends and says, don't come to the house. Just speak the word, because I'm a man who understands authority, and I understand what it means to be under authority. If you speak the word, it will happen. Well, Jesus was amazed at that, but it also tells us a principle. Unless you're willing to follow someone, you're never going to be big enough to lead. I remember a statement I read back in my college days, and that's a long time ago. Someone said this: if you're too big to follow, you'll always be too small to lead. We've got to learn how to come under authority. We've got to be accountable to someone. We have to walk in submission. The third stepping stone to growing this type of spiritual authority I find in Exodus chapter 3 in the life of Moses. In Exodus chapter 3, he encountered a burning bush. And it was at that moment that God called him. Now, it took some time. If you were to read the rest of chapter 3 and into chapter 4, you'll find it took him some time to be convinced that he was called. But that is the foundational principle that needs to happen if we're going to have spiritual authority. We've got to be convinced that God has called us to do these things. Once he got to that place, he began to lead with spiritual authority. Now, when I talk about being called, I'm not talking about being called to be a deliverer of a nation. But we need to be convinced in whatever we're doing, whatever God's told us to do, that he wants us to do those things. It's kind of like Romans chapter 8. Paul says, I'm convinced, there's that word, I'm convinced that neither life nor death, principalities or powers, he goes on to say a bunch of other things, they can't separate me from the love of God. See, he'd gone through a process to be convinced of that. You and I, in order to have spiritual authority, have to be convinced that he has sent us to do what we're doing. It may not be leading a nation. Maybe it's having coffee with a brother or a sister. Maybe it's leading a journey group. Maybe it's participating in a journey group or overseeing a Bible study. Once you reach that point that, hey, I'm doing this because God sent me to do this, there's an authority about your life. Because when God sends you to do something, he always gives you the equipment to do what needs to be done. The fourth stepping stone is also found in Exodus chapter 3 at the burning bush. And I see that Moses did three things. He stopped, he looked, and he listened. The reason that that's so important is because our authority doesn't come from our heads. It comes from our hearts and our experiences. Someone said one time, if you teach people from your head, you're going to hit their head. But if you teach them from the heart, you'll touch their hearts. Our experiences are the foundation for our authority. And if you never stop to look at what's happening in your life, if you never take time to reflect, the Bible says, be still and know that I'm God. Take time to reflect on your life. If you never just look at what's going on, you just kind of glance at things now and then. I try every day, and I don't always do it every day, but on a regular basis, I try to stop and say, God, did I miss something? Are you trying to teach me something that I'm missing? I want to look and find out what you're saying. And then listen. Stop, look, and listen. James says, don't just listen, go on and do something. In this fourth step, it's very important for us to know our calling, and we do that by stopping, looking, and listening. And last of all, the last step I'd like to share with you comes from Matthew chapter 20, where Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says, you know the Gentiles use their authority to lord it over people. But that's not the spiritual authority that I'm talking about. That's never to happen in you. If you're going to develop spiritual authority, you're going to have to put on the garment of humility. You have to continue to say, I'm not going to dictate. I'm not going to dominate people. I'm not going to try to drive people. I'm going to share what God has done for me so that then he can do what he wants to do in the lives of people. Now, if you take these 5 steps, I can guarantee that they'll assist you in the process of developing spiritual authority. There's more steps that can be covered, but those have helped me. Hopefully, they'll help you. I'm talking to people who want to cultivate the spiritual life of a leader, and one of those segments that has to do with our leadership is spiritual authority. God bless you today.